Okay, we're picking up here with 2 Samuel, and we looked at 1 Samuel, and that covers the life of Samuel. It covers the reign of Saul, and we get to the end of 1 Samuel, and Saul falls on his sword. His armor bearer says he's dead, and we've got a little conflict when we start 2 Samuel because it looks like a guy comes along and says, well, Saul wasn't actually dead at that time, but we'll handle that. Samuel, it basically covers the reign of David, and what we're looking at there is it's a narrative. It's a pretty easy book to read. There's a couple of places where there's a lot of names listed, but not very much, and so it's something that you should go through and read. It's a narrative of the king that's really the predecessor to the idea of the King of Kings over all of Israel, and the one who will sit on this king's throne, the Messiah. And so it's an important background to have if you're reading the Bible, to know about the life of David. So in chapter 1, we have a situation where the account is given. An Amalekite man comes to David, says that he had seen Saul agonizing, having fallen on his sword. He wasn't quite dead, and Saul commissions him over there to come over and finish him off. And so this man says he goes over and kills him. And that's a little different than the account we see at the end of 1 Samuel. So we don't know if what we see at the end of 1 Samuel is the armor bearer looked at Saul, thought he was dead, and decided, I'm going to die too, and Saul wasn't quite dead, or if this Amalekite's making up a story. And some people have taken up two different sides on this. Well, the Amalekite probably thought, David would be glad to hear that Saul was dead. However, David has this unique thing of honoring people for their position, and honoring people and being able to see that God was using them or had usefulness for them, even if they were opposed to him. Now, a lot of us have that. We have a problem with that. We find if people are opposed to us, we figure, well, God can't be using them or can't like them because they don't like me, and who wouldn't like me, So some of us have a problem with that, but David had an unusual ability to honor those that God had put in position. That's why, he would say, I can't stand against God's anointed. I can't lift my hand. I can't touch in that way, touch in an evil way, God's anointed. And so David held to that. So this Amalekite guy comes up and says that he had seen Saul and he finished him off. And David said to him, after David mourned the loss of Saul and his friend Jonathan, in verse 14 of chapter 1, it says, Then David said to him, How is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? The very thing that David would say, he couldn't touch the Lord's anointed. He's saying that still about Saul, even with just a little breath left in him. And maybe Saul did say, come and kill me. But David says, how could you do that? Because he was God's anointed. How could you take it into your own hands to do something against Saul? So anyway, we've got now Saul is dead. David is a new king anointed by Samuel years before, but he doesn't immediately become king of all Israel. David ends up going to Hebron, and is anointed king of Judah by the men of Judah. But even in that, he's not king over all of Israel. And later, Judah is called Judah, but it's Judah and Benjamin. Here, Judah is just Judah. It's Judah and the other 11 tribes of Israel. And the other 11 tribes are under the reign of Ishbosheth, which is Saul's son. And he's made king over the rest of Israel. So in the next chapters, it would be good for you to read all of that. There's a lot of stuff going back and forth between Israel and Judah, the battles for power and authority, and who's really the recognized whatever, the king. So there's war between Judah and Israel until the kingdom is finally united under David. And in chapter 5, we see that. So chapter 5, verse 4, it says, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So he was 30 years when he became king, and at 37, he became king over Jerusalem, over all of Judah and Israel. So, and then for 40 years total, he was king. So about 70 years old, we see that David's lifespan was going to be. So David became stronger, and he was conquering all of his enemies around the surrounding area. It says in chapter 6, verse 1 through 3. Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal Judah. That's the name of a place. Baal is associated, this false god is associated with so many different other qualifying names in the Old Testament, because it's basically this one God who has apparently these other ruling areas, like God of the sea or God of this or God of that. Well, we see that all through the Old Testament the Lord is defeating this Baal God in all of his forms. Anyway, the people who were with him to Baal Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name. Now, they would say the name because they didn't want to use the Lord's name vainly and mispronounce it or something. Instead of saying Yahweh, they would just sometimes say the name. The very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. And they placed the Ark of God on a new cart that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. So here we see David's desire to bring the Ark of God that's captured back into Israel. It's important for David to honor the Lord, and to there's even Psalms written about this occasion. We may hit those in the future. So anyway, verse 4 says, so they brought it with the Ark of God and from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, and with lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. So there's this incredible celebration going on because the ark's coming back to Israel. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. Really a tough situation, and probably something most of us would do. The ark coming in on this new cart, and that's the problem. The problem is it's coming in on a new cart. That's not the instruction the Lord gave of how to transport the ark. The ark is to go on the shoulders of the Levites on two poles along each side, a pole on each side, and 4 men carrying the ark. But here they're doing it their own way. And that's kind of the same thing we see in 1 Samuel 15, where it says the Lord desires obedience and not sacrifice. Here Uzzah's trying to do the good thing. He's trying to do something that would be sacrificial and going out of his way to help the ark from falling. But the problem is, that's not what God said. What God said is that you're to take it this certain way, and if you don't do it that way, you've opened yourself up to problems. And if we try and do it our own way, even if we think it's a very sacrificially religious thing to do or whatever, we're still in disobedience to what God really said and how he wants it to be done. And so it's called irreverence here for him. Uzzah's reaching out and touching the ark. He wasn't supposed to touch the ark. No one was supposed to touch the ark in the transportation of the ark. It was supposed to be on the shoulders, on these poles. It was supposed to be transported that way. Verse 8, and David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day, which means the Lord broke through a breakthrough, the breakthrough of Uzzah. So anyway. So David was afraid, verse 9, of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? It's like, how are we going to get it there if we can't do it this way? David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Well, here it's like, well, we can give it to Obed-Edom. I'm not going to take it to my house. This thing's dangerous, but let's leave it here with Obed-Edom. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So they leave the ark there, and Obed-Edom's prospering from the presence of the Lord being right there in his house. And so what we'll look at here next is how David resolves the situation and actually sees, hey, this looks pretty good, and he decides to bring the ark to his house.